It is a well-known fact that oil is still on board the battleship Arizona. The wreck is one of the most iconic and recognizable war memorials in the United States and probably even the world. Every day, thousands of people take the ferry across Pearl Harbor to visit the wreck, and when you're there, the scent of oil is inescapable. The battleship sank with nearly full fuel tanks, and oil has been leaking from the wreck for the last 80 years. If you're wondering how the oil escapes the wreck, you should check out my previous video about Arizona. But if you've already seen it, then we'll need to talk about this comment, because they bring up two very important questions. Isn't it a good idea to remove the oil as soon as possible? And if we know where the fuel tanks are, couldn't we get to them without disturbing the wreck? The answer is yes and no. Of course, letting oil leak out into the environment is bad, especially since Arizona and many other American warships carried bunker C fuel, which is a very toxic, heavy oil that's almost like a tar. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to get to the oil. In the past, navies and salvage companies have removed oil from sunken warships before, like in the mid-2000s, the British removed hundreds of tons from their battleship HMS Royal Oak up in Scapa Flow. Then in 2018, the U.S. Navy recovered more than 200,000 gallons from the German cruiser Prince Eugen out in the Marshall Islands. But Arizona is different. Unlike the other two, she's upright, so any tanks in the double bottom are not very easy to access. But more importantly, she's not just sitting on the bottom of the harbor, she's embedded in the silt. All of her oil tanks are under the mudline, so you'd have to dredge around almost the entire ship and underneath it to reach the double bottom. To make matters worse, we don't know which fuel tanks were full or empty when she sank, or which ones became empty after the explosion. It's a pretty safe bet that there's no oil around the magazines, but how far aft do those empty tanks go, and where do the partially full tanks begin? Whoever goes to remove the oil will need to check every tank, including the ones in the more fragile areas. Now, all of that is possible if the Navy were determined to do it. We know where the oil tanks are, they could dig around the ship and check all of the fuel stowage, and we should be able to pump out the fuel in the tanks with minimal damage to the wreck itself. But that's not quite the whole picture. It only solves a part of the problem because the fuel tanks are not the only place with oil. The ship is full of pipes to transport the oil, there are also machines on board that use the oil, and there's reason to believe that the pipes and machine still do contain oil and are also leaking. The evidence for that is around the stern, because the explosion only really damaged the forward half of the ship. The tanks around the stern should have stayed intact, but remember, on the second deck, the National Park Service found oil pools in the overheads in the officer staterooms. That has to come from somewhere, and it could be from the engine rooms directly underneath them on the second platform. It could be coming from the oil tanks, but there could also be cracked pipes, the engines themselves could be leaking, and valves and seals could be broken. So even if someone manages to remove all the oil from the fuel tanks, there is more on board that is still trapped within the wreck. And that leads us to the real big problem. We don't know where the rest of the oil is. If you recall, most of the oil takes at least a month to pass through the wreck and physically exit the ship. During that time, it collects in pools in the overhead, like the ones the National Park Service found. However, there are probably many more under the crew's galley. The galley is at the top of the explosion crater, so it should collect oil from other collapsed compartments forward, especially from the boiler rooms forward of Frame 78. ROVs and divers can't enter those collapsed spaces to tell where the pools are or how much oil is in those pools. It would be much more challenging to remove that oil because you need to cut through the ship just to find it, and you'd risk even more collapsing. But with all of that said, there is still some good news. Arizona as a whole probably won't collapse anytime soon, or at least not catastrophically. We've already seen localized collapsing that releases oil, and there's no doubt that that'll continue, but Studies suggest Arizona should be recognizable for the next 100 years. One of the features of the wreck is that the further down you go, the slower the corrosion is. The upper decks with the pools of oil are collapsing now, and will be for the foreseeable future, but the intact fuel tanks down under the armor deck will almost certainly last longer, maybe into 2250. So the Navy and National Park Service have time to come up with a plan if they ever choose to do anything.